Hello and welcome to D Infinity Live, the always sophisticated, seldom underrated, never dunderpated. This morning we all master the art of Taiwanese cooking, multi-platform, multi-publisher gaming podcast. I'm your host, William T. Thrasher. With me, as always, is Michael O. Varhola, not as jolly today as he was last week, and returning to the show after a long hiatus, Richard T. Balsley.
Hey.
And joining us once again, friend of the show, Clint Staples.
Hey.
And tonight our topic is puzzles, riddles, and games within games. But before we jump into that topic, we do have some news for you. Mike, what is going on right now at our website, d-infinity.net?
Well, there is a ton of new material up there, as always. Chris Van Deelen had worked through a series of something like 300 basic system monsters that could be used for Labyrinth Lord or Mutant Future or really any D20 successor game. And he'd gotten to Z and then didn't post anything for a couple of days. And we started hearing from people, oh my God, what's going on? This guy's posted for a year every day and now nothing. And then within the last few days, he started posting again with his Ouroboros Obscura, Swamp Vine, and Trans Adepts write-ups. So Chris Van Deelen is still active on the site, and we are pleased to see that. I've been posting defects. I've got a couple up there that I posted recently, including one based on observed behavior, my favorite kind of defect, called Yacker. So try that out with an NPC in the party and see how everything goes for you. And then we've had some really great essays by some of our pretty impressive writers and game developers. Chris Van Deelen's got sort of an eclectic one that's about everything that he's working on. Dr. Eric Lee, MD, has a good one on the role of plants like peppers in healing. So that can certainly put an interesting spin on your on your healing potions. And then Clint has got a great piece on the history of the staff sling, and it's interesting. Clint and I have been talking with people for the past several days about the staff sling, and we discovered two things that I think are interesting. Clint can tell me if they're interesting or not. One, we've had readers who did not realize the staff sling was an actual real weapon. They'd seen it turn up in gaming materials, so they thought it was just something made up. And then the other thing is readers who thought the Hoopak, which was actually this sort of absurd Dennis the Menace slingshot at the end of a long stick that was introduced to Dragonlance, we've had some of them think it was a real weapon. So I think there's something to be said for being the gaming outfit that's actually publishing things about real-world history, so that people can incorporate into that into just producing made-up crap. Well, there's plenty of that out there. Actually producing real things so people can understand the way these things work. I think there's some value to that. So thanks to Clint for that. So that's what's up at d-infinity.net. Infinity Online. A lot of good material, and I would encourage people, as always, to check it out.
Excellent. And Richard, what do we have going on with our co-publisher, Skirmisher Publishing?
Well, we got several things that have been new since the last week or so, and one of those is a new bundle. So everybody who wants to get Wisdom from the Wastelands 36 through 40 as in one fell swoop, we got that out for you. And also issue 41 of the same series is out. And there's also Swords of Coast Encounters, which is a collection of random monster tables for you to use with Swords of Coast or any setting.
Very, very cool.
Yep. And most of us have contributed to those encounter tables. I wrote a number of them. I know Richard wrote some fun ones, including the one for the Republic of Rome and the Majocracy of Mesopotamia. And Will, you did the one on the...
I have Amazonia and Zaweri, I think.
And the tyrant Manticore-ruled country of Abadonia.
Oh, that's right. That was a dark random encounter table.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
If you want a random encounter table where you can randomly encounter slaves digging their own mass grave, the Abydonia encounter table is for you.
Not cheerful, but for you.
Well, it is a brutal, tyrannical nation, and that is completely reflected in that table.
Yeah, and it really comes through. But yeah, Encounters has got a lot of really good material, and if you want 17 random encounter tables broken out by different types of country or terrain, then yeah, this is absolutely a good bet.
All right. Well, with that out of the way, I think we're ready to dive ahead into our main topic, which is puzzles, riddles, and games. And before we get into our viewer questions and viewer riddles, I just wanted to go around the table and just ask everybody in general, how do you feel about puzzles, riddles, and games within games at the tabletop? And in my case, I love them, but they can be overused so heavily. If you want a puzzle, a riddle, what have you in a game, I feel like it really needs to be well motivated. It can't be in a game simply because all traditional tabletop games have them. There has to be a real reason to give that puzzle or riddle some kind of weight at the tabletop. How about you, Richard?
Yeah, I believe that they're useful tools. And unfortunately, they're like dice. People don't know how to use them properly, so they overuse them for everything. I mean, Mike laughs, but it's true, because sometimes, bad things should happen just to keep the story moving. Otherwise, you never know what's going to happen. Or if something really bad happens with dice, same thing. Puzzles are the same way, because the most important thing to keep in mind with the puzzle is that they should fit the type of encounter. So, like, if you have something that the mood requires some kind of puzzle, then you should use it. Otherwise, no.
How about you, Mike?
Well, as far as overusing puzzles, I don't overuse them. If anything, I don't use them enough. I'm not particularly good with incorporating puzzles or riddles into games. I always want to do it, and I don't think that it is my strong suit. I do some things that tie in with that fall into the subject matter that we're discussing. I love games within games. I mean, one of the things that makes Hamlet such a fun play and why people respond to it is because it has that play within a play. People love that, the whole thing within a thing. And having a game within the game where the characters can actually roll knuckle bones against each other. And then if it has some impact on the way things proceed in the game itself, or if the game itself has some impact on the game within a game. I mean, that can be fun. You sort of get attention flowing both ways. So I love a game within a game, and I like tricks. I like especially leaving false clues for players. And if anyone's ever read my Bloodsuckers in Swords of Kos Hecaton, they'll see what I mean about false clues that can allow the players to draw incorrect conclusions. And if anyone reads Return to the Necropolis, I've got a big episode that leads to a misunderstanding between the player characters and a party of dwarves because of a trail of clues that they misinterpret. So false clues and games within games, those are two things that I like to incorporate into my sessions.
Cool. And how about you, Clint?
A couple of things occur to me. First of all, I have a love-hate relationship with puzzles generally. As a player, I tend to hate them because my brain doesn't work that way very well. So I find myself sort of sitting on the sidelines wishing that the smart people would figure out the puzzle so we can move on. And it's just it's frustrating for me as a player. As a GM, I kind of like them, but what that leads to my the second part of my point, which is that it has to suit the group as well as suit the setting. And so I think, as Richard said, it's really easy to overuse them or to overstress them, so that your players are sitting there going, "Okay, fine, can we just turn on the TV?" Or something like that, as opposed to getting into it, right? It's fine to reach that point in say Lord of the Rings where friend and enter, right? And they're sitting around for 3 hours, and you do a nice tasteful fade out, and then the light bulb goes on over somebody's head, and you go and you enter, right? But that doesn't happen around a gaming table. The whole 3 hours, you can sit there and do nothing unless the GM takes a hand and moves things along. So I think it's way too easy for that to happen. But as far as games within games, I love that. And as GM, I do that for just about every game I've ever run. I've had games within games. So.
Very cool. We got our first comment this evening. This ties into something we just said from Shane Allen about puzzles. I just hate them, and my characters started off liking them, but by the end of the game, we had encountered so many NPCs that had riddles and puzzles for us anytime we met someone. My new character's first words were always, "I swear to Cuthbert, if you have a puzzle, you're going to regret it." And I think what Shane has encountered is, puzzle overload.
Right.
And as I said before, the puzzle needs to be motivated. It can't be in your game because games have puzzles. There needs to be something, real going on. There has to be a real test of the character or player's intellect. There has to be some real problem that's going to be solved by solving this riddle. There is nothing more frustrating in a tabletop game or even a computer game when you go up to an NPC and you just want to buy a new dagger, but for some reason, I'll give you a discount if you answer this arbitrary riddle about snakes for some reason. And it's a speed bump.
On the other hand, that kind of irritation can actually help build the feel of certain settings. So, for example, in the Wonderland setting, if you read Alice in Wonderland or Alice Through the Looking Glass, everybody is doing just what you said, asking absurdist little questions or making little quips, and it does end up being absurdist. And most of the time there is no answer to the questions they're asking, but that is incorporated to help set the tone for the sort of surreal, absurdist environment. It sounds like in what our listener is asking about is the intent was never to make the setting absurdist or irritating, and that's what happened. So it's incongruous.
How about Richard Clint? Do you want to weigh in on this?
Well, one of my favorite games from a long time ago is RuneQuest, set in Glorantha. And one of the things that they had in there is one of the chaos deities was named Nicelor. And he had illuminating questions that his priests would go and ask people. And chaos in RuneQuest was a bad thing. Unless you were a follower of chaos, you didn't want to deal with it. And so a Riddler of Nicelor asking you a question, whether you listened and answered the question or not, you ran the risk of being influenced, being touched, tainted by chaos. And so this was a game that I was a player in, and most of the other players were heavy-duty cultists who hated chaos and were chaos-hating cults. So whenever they ran into chaos generally, their first response was to go and kill it. And so the GM had us meet a series of Riddlers of Nicelor, and as soon as one opened up his mouth, the overwhelming response in the group was to attack with both barrels from everybody in the party. So it was completely counter to what the game and the GM was trying to accomplish, which was sinister King in Yellow or Nyarlathotep kind of offer kind of thing, and all it got was the automatic squish response from everybody in the group. So that was one that totally did not work.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Well, you got to know your party, like you said, Clint.
You got to know your party, yeah. And he should have known his party because,
Oh, we've got a good one from my brother Robert who wants to know, Frank Gorshin, great Riddler or greatest Riddler? I will go ahead and put myself down for greatest Riddler. However, coming in at a close second is John Astin whenever he would stand in on that role in the old 1950s Batman or 1960s Batman TV series. How do you all vote?
They all bring their own shtick to it. Jim Carrey is just so great at physical comedy that he played that role pretty well. So,
I like Frank Gorshin because he did special effects with his face before they could do special effects. He had kind of a rubber face, and he could grin further than humans should be able to grin, and that's key for a character like the Riddler.
And actually, Jim Carrey modeled his performance off of Frank Gorshin. So there you go.
There you have it.
Modeled is one way to describe it, yeah. And actually, speaking of riddles, I've got the first of one of our viewer-submitted riddles, and this comes from Rick Schmelz, who got it from a former game master of his, a Chad Eagleton. And I'm just going to read out this riddle. If one of you thinks you know the answer, jump right in. If you're stumped, bow out, and we'll go ahead and reveal the answer. So the riddle is, alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, always drinking, always armored, never clinking.
An ice cube tray.
Nope.
That's out of Tolkien.
I was going to say a glass.
That's
Although, that's a good one.
that's one of Gollum's riddles in The Hobbit.
My wife says that that's one of Gollum's riddles from The Hobbit.
Oh, does she know the answer?
I can't remember the answer. It's an old Anglo-Saxon riddle.
She also says that it's an old Anglo-Saxon riddle.
Oh, that is cool. I like a riddle with some history behind it. The answer is a fish.
Yeah, that's it.
Which
Well, that makes
makes
sense.
for
That's a
Gollum.
Gollum-esque riddle, right? So, because he was always crawling around in caves eating sightless fish, so that makes sense.
And here we have a question from my fiancée, Sarah Allen, who wants to know how to deal with the issue of a player being smarter than their character when it comes to puzzle solving. And here she relates the story. She once had a druid character who was less intelligent than her animal companion, and the GM was holding them to the rule that if your intelligence was low enough, you actually could not read, write, or even speak. I've got two ways of handling that problem. One, no matter what the tables in the book say, your character can speak unless you take a flaw for muteness or not being a native speaker of everyone else's language. I think that's a silly rule that should just be stricken from the book. I don't care how realistic that rule's meant to be. All it is an impediment to gameplay. And I guess on the other angle, I don't presume anybody is going to be playing a character any more or less clever than they are. So when it comes to things like riddles, puzzles, and whatnot, no matter how dumb the character is, if the player comes up with the solution, I'll allow it. I think the player has earned it, and that's going to happen. It's not like your character is a barbarian with an intelligence of 2 and you come up against a computer, and because the player knows something about computers, he wants the barbarian to be able to operate this machine flawlessly. No, this is something completely different. How about you, Clint?
I tend not to think of intelligence, the stat intelligence, as a limiter on a player's intellect, but a limiter on the way that their intelligence interacts with the game. So if someone has a high IQ character, that means that they have good ideas at the exact moment when they are at their best, the perfect moment for those ideas. If they have a low intelligence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're stupid. It means that their intellect is not high performance, as it were. They may reach the same conclusion as someone with an 18 intelligence, but it may take them longer to get there. And so I prefer not to limit players to their stats. Rather, I prefer to encourage them to role play them in a way that reflects them, but still gives them the means to answer whatever situation arises.
How about you, Richard?
I guess I'm kind of different than that because I looked for some verisimilitude in the game that I'm running, mostly because since we are playing a storytelling game and everybody's contributing and they're trying to play out a role, the character may not be the smartest in the world, but at the same time, you gotta have the players stick with the roles that they chose for their characters, right? So if you have the wizard who's really smart, but the player can't figure it out, then I might say, okay, maybe you can help out the wizard and give them the idea. So it's that character's idea, but it can't be the dumb character's idea because that's not their specialty. And so for that, I allow a little bit of table talking for that, so that way people can get the answers quicker. But I make sure that the credit goes to the character that should get the credit for that moment of the story. So that way, the dumb character who's like really really like strong, you get to that point where like the other characters can't move the boulder out of the way, but he can, then he gets the credit for that, even if at the time he couldn't come up with the solution, and somebody else has to say, "Dude, that's your job." So it kind of works so everybody's characters gets the spotlight when it's appropriate. So that way I get past the aspect of, well, your stats don't allow you to do that.
Well, then Frodo's not that bright, so how do you handle him solving speak, friend, and enter before Gandalf?
The only thing I can say with that is he's an NPC, and so it's like like any other NPC, he just has to sit back and let the players figure it out if they can.
Well, and keep in mind, Tolkien's making a statement there too about common people having sort of a native wisdom and having an insight that the experts don't necessarily have. So he's making a social statement as much as a qualitative statement about a character's intelligence with that.
We've got another viewer-submitted riddle. This one comes to us from friend of the show, Richard Penwarden. And gentlemen, here is your riddle. When you see your enemy, at first I retreat, but within a mile of my advance, your foe knows defeat. Three, 2, 1. Any answers?
I'm
Fire?
stumped.
What was that?
Fire?
No, but you're kind of close. That was an arrow, because you got to pull it back before you can fire it.
Clever.
And it kills over a great distance, as we learned at the Battle of Trafalgar. Or wasn't it the Battle of Agincourt? Now I'm getting my 100 Years Wars mixed up.
Trafalgar was when, Clint?
Napoleonic.
It was Napoleonic, but was that 1806? Was it that early?
I forget. I think it was 05 or 04.
Yeah, it was pretty early, but that was a naval battle fought with cannons.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to add moderately educational to the opening of next week's show. Thanks to that interlude. Our next question comes from, friend of the show, Daryl Mott Jr., who a lot of you will remember from our comic live episode from Comic Palooza. Wants to know.
Daryl Mott, absolutely.
Yeah.
We were drinking margaritas with him last time we saw him on the show.
Yeah. Oh, so you can now confirm that those were margaritas.
Oh yeah, that was a bucket of frozen margaritas. Absolutely. Of course.
Marvelous.
That was the sixth host on the show was a bucket of margaritas.
We'll have to invite that host back next year.
Exactly.
Yeah, and actually this touches on something we were talking about a moment earlier. How do you handle player knowledge versus character knowledge in riddles? Do you sacrifice fun to let a character with a high mental stat just roll, or do you sacrifice verisimilitude and make them role play it out? In general, when it comes to riddles, I always err on the side of role playing, mainly because, in my experience, well, first, if you just allow a character to roll, and if they get high enough, they get the answer, then there was almost no point for that riddle challenge to begin with. You might as well have just pulled the right answer out of a hat. But secondly, if you're one of those, from experience, those times when I would say, okay, if you make an intelligence check and succeed, I'll give you some sort of hint. I found that either the hint completely gave away the riddle, or the hint completely it was an accurate hint, but it still completely confounded the player, because riddles kind of require a certain amount of thinking. It's not like putting building blocks together. It's more like shuffling tiles around to get an image. And I feel like in both cases it would destroy the thrill and the nature of the puzzle.
I guess I would say, going back to the last question and to this one, that disconnect between the player's actual intelligence and the character's sheet intelligence, I guess what I would say is I'd fall somewhere in between, and I'd err on the side of keeping the game moving along in a fun and compelling way. So and I'm a big fan of giving experience points or awards based on non-combat type things. So if I'm going to be giving, say, 400 experience points for solving a particular riddle, and the players put their heads together and there's not a lot of dead time and they're all engaged and it's moving along, and one way or another they solve it on their own as a party, and I prefer that, because then, what Richard was describing was encouraging a party style of play, and I think that's great. I think that's terrific. So it doesn't really matter if it's the player of the stupid character that comes up with the answer. If the party's working together and they all come up with the answer, that's good. And then they get 400 experience points. But if that riddle is the linchpin that tells us whether the party's going to continue to move on, and everybody's eyes are glazing over and they're bogging down and they can't get it, you know what? We're going to go down to ability score rolls or skill rolls. Then you really do just get to make your decipher script roll or your bardic knowledge roll. And if they get it, then what do they get? Well, they don't get their 400 XP. They maybe get 200 XP or 100 XP or no experience points, but they're allowed to then move on. So I would use a composite method that allowed the game to keep moving in a compelling and interesting and plausible way, that started off with deferring to role-playing and the characters, but then fell back on the other tools that the game gives you.
How about you, Clint?
Well, I think that covers it very well. I think the main thing you have to do is, with any encounter, whether it's a riddle encounter or a combat encounter or a social encounter, is gauge interest level and frustration levels. And it's sort of a sliding scale. If all the players are becoming frustrated, then you have to do something to move the game forward. And if it's a combat situation, then you have to change the situation so that the combat can be resolved in some way. If it's a riddle situation, then you have to do what's required to move the game through and past that riddle.
Or to turn away from it altogether. To say,
Sure.
you just like you don't have the key to this door, you can't go through this door today, you don't have the answer to the riddle, you've got to go into a sub-adventure whereby you can learn the answer to the riddle, or just continue on with something else and come back to it. That's an option that we hadn't discussed either. That maybe just failing to solve the riddle and having to move on and do something different. That is not necessarily a fatal or a final an option that doesn't have recourse.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, because that's with both riddles and puzzles, it's vitally important to make sure that not being able to solve the riddle or solve the puzzle can't stop that failure can't stop your game dead in its tracks.
Right.
You need to be open to your players coming up with clever solutions that allow them to go around that challenge, whether they're frustrated by that challenge or not. Sometimes it's helpful to put in a little escape clause, or don't make solving the puzzle or the riddle either or. Just give some sort of real consequence for failure. So that way, even if they don't solve it, something will happen, but then they can get on with the rest of the adventure.
Right.
And again, don't be surprised if your players do something you did not expect at all. Once was in a game where they had to answer a riddle, and lo and behold, the moment one of the players got frustrated, he just murdered the guy who asked the riddle, searched through his pockets, found a book of riddles, and read the answer out of the book out loud. And that was a solution. It got the job done, and it was a memorable scene. Oh, right. Well, before we're going to go ahead and move on to puzzles and games within games next, but I did want to know, do you guys have any books with any good riddles or have a good structure for creating a riddle-based encounter? Mike?
Well, there's so many out there. I'd mentioned the Wonderland books, but those are more absurdist when it comes to riddles, but still fun, still a good model, and they have the chess game in the context of the Wonderland stories. So there is a chess game that takes place within the story, so you could have a chess game where the characters were chess pieces. Probably half the people who are listening have done that. And of course, there are living cards in Wonderland. I think Wonderland's really good. If you want to go to the opposite end of the spectrum, something that's newer, much more sophisticated, much more dense, Umberto Eco, Foucault's Pendulum, Name of the Rose, those are all full. I mean, Umberto Eco is what, Clint, a semiologist?
Semiologist.
And an expert on medieval symbolism. So there's if you've read Dan Brown, the acid test is to whether you're actually intelligent is whether you can also read Umberto Eco. So you know this is the next step in your evolution as a reader. If you read Angels and Demons, see if you can read Foucault's Pendulum and see what you get out of it. But I would say he is a good model for the puzzle or the code or the cryptogram or whatever in the context of a story. And I say story game, I use those synonymously. So yeah, I'd go with Lewis Carroll on the one hand and Umberto Eco on the other.
Now, how about you, Clint? Any good sources?
Well, a couple that I mentioned in the comments leading up to the show. We were going back and forth with posts and stuff like that in the few days ago and such. One is I really enjoyed Patricia McKillip's Riddle Master of Head and how she incorporated the idea of riddles essentially as a way of conveying, of teaching lore in a society that did not necessarily rely on written tomes and such. They had writing and stuff like that, but a lot of the information was conveyed essentially by Socratic method and dialogue. And so riddle masters were automatically understood to be educated and intelligent and quick-witted. In fact, the protagonist of the story of the trilogy is a guy who effectively is one of the finest of the riddle masters who does not get recognized as such, and he ends up returning to his homeland and all this kind of thing. But riddles feature throughout the trilogy in that way, and it's a very cool way to incorporate that as a core concept of a world. So the other one is sort of a dark version of the Wonderland idea, and that was a scenario that was put out for the old Chaosium Elric role-playing game about 20-25 years ago, and it was a Balo the Jester demon prince.
Oh, the Jester of the Lords of Chaos, yes.
Yeah, has essentially a dungeon of his own that if you pick up one of Balo's cursed coins, it immediately transports you to his dungeon, and he gets to play with you, essentially, to game you. And if you survive his trials and games and stuff, you can win great fortune. But you can also come out with a set of donkey ears stuck on your head in place of your regular ears, or similar things like that. I never got to play it. I never got to run it, but I always wanted to. So, but it had similar things like a living chessboard and that kind of stuff as well. So.
And that's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, actually, it's very fortuitous you mentioned Balo. Just this morning, I finished reading Michael Moorcock's The Vanishing Tower, where Balo first appears.
Okay.
So the powers of chaos are at work today.
Awesome.
The Vanishing Tower, that's the one with Prince Gaynor the Damned, whose space is a massive maggots, and he has to keep it covered under a helmet. Is that the one I'm thinking of?
I think that's a different one. The Vanishing Towers were like this tower appears out of nowhere at the edge of this kingdom, and Elric gets hired by this queen and her cuckolded mage boyfriend to
all right.
investigate.
Yeah.
And how about you, Richard?
The only one that I've actually come across gaming related was Wizards of the Coast Book of Challenges, in terms of like a book that was built specifically to help game masters come up with ways to like create puzzles and riddles for their games. Other than that, the only thing that I could say is just ripping off anything I can find from other games, like Zork.
Yeah, actually, video games are a great source for puzzles and riddles. I have shamelessly liberated a number of puzzles from the Professor Layton series. Actually, my Swords of Coast adventure, Sticks and Stones, actually uses that for the Labyrinth, where there are 7 chambers in the Labyrinth. Each one contains a statue of a Greek god that will come to life and attack you if you enter that chamber, except for the statue of the Greek god you actually want to visit, and you have to use this number code to figure out what god, using process of elimination, what god could possibly be in what chamber. It's very cool stuff. There's lots of stuff to liberate from that.
That is an example of I think a particularly good puzzle type thing that is actually incorporated into the fabric of the adventure. Yeah, Sticks and Stones
yes.
is a good example of that.
And then just another good book for inspiration about that would be XDM, which has a whole chapter on riddles and puzzles and how to work them into storytelling. It has some great examples, and it's not just these kind of rhyming "what am I" riddles like we've been talking about, or like we've had examples of the show, but it also has a whole thing about how to construct a really good logic-based riddle or puzzle to confound your players, and also a diagram to explain how the guardian that always tells the truth and the guardian that always lies actually works, which is very, very useful to have if you want to try to duplicate that encounter from Labyrinth.
Yeah, I hate that.
There's a better one than that from a game called Kingdom of Loathing, which you can play online. There's a challenge where there's 3 ogres, I think it is. One always tells the truth, one always lies, and the other one sometimes tells the truth. And you have to get the security code from them, and you have to figure out which one's telling you the right information and which one is always wrong and which one is trying to mislead you.
And I think anyone who's a true old school gamer, and certainly Clint and I would assume have a shared experience in this. Back in first edition D&D, this was a big deal. The genie or the demon or the devil that would grant you a wish, and it would try to pervert the intent of it. Yeah. So basically, you had what I would call a series of opposed rolls. They weren't rolls, but they were opposed skill tests, opposed skill checks between the player and the DM. And it was the player trying to phrase something in a way that couldn't be twisted or perverted, and then the DM legitimately looking for a loophole in that, not just screwing players, but legitimately looking for a way to pervert the intent without actually, just arbitrarily contravening what the player said. That was sort of an opposed kind of riddle-type challenge that we used to have all the time back in the day, right, Clint?
Yeah, there's actually a good example, flippant example of that in the Malay Wizard, the Fantasy Trip, which had a similar sort of mechanic where the demons would grant wishes, but would do everything possible to pervert the letter of the wish. And so the character says, "Demon, make me a milkshake," and of course the demon says, "Zap, you're a milkshake."
And before we get into the next part of the show, we've got one more riddle I want to throw at you. This was submitted by Jack V. Butler Jr., who found it's an old Henry Wadsworth Longfellow riddle, and it goes as follows: "If you break me, I do not stop working. If you touch me, I may be ensnared. If you lose me, nothing will matter. Gentlemen."
A tooth.
Your hair.
Not bad. You're all on the right track.
Okay.
It's the heart.
Oh, okay. Not bad.
All right. Well, moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit more about puzzles and puzzles. There's a lot of overlap between puzzles and riddles, but one of the things that's even more important is there has to be an in-game justification for it. I don't know. I guess I got to ask you guys this: have any of you, course of your daily life, encountered an actual puzzle that prevented you from doing something until you solved that puzzle?
The DMV.
You consider that a puzzle?
Yes, I do. If you've ever had to deal with the DMV, especially here in California, you understand how much bureaucracy and every other thing that you have to do to jump through hoops and get crap done, and how nightmarish that can really be.
The only thing I can think of similar was
there's a reason.
Sorry.
I was going to say there's a reason why there's a Primus song that has the lyric, "I've been to hell, I spell it DMV." If you've ever been there, you know exactly what I mean.
Have I ever actually in real life encountered a puzzle that kept me from moving ahead with something? You know, two things have happened to me just this week that aren't exactly what we're describing. They wouldn't be very good puzzles in the context of a game, but they're things that I've stumbled across in my research. I have been researching and writing about the old Spanish governor's palace in downtown San Antonio, and it was built by a Spanish governor who was appointed in 1705 and was built in 1749. And the keystone, and Clint is brilliant, the keystone above the Spanish governor's palace has a double-headed eagle and has the date 1749, the year 1749 on it. And everything I've read says this is the Habsburg eagle. This is the Habsburg double-headed eagle. Well, the Habsburgs stopped ruling Spain in 1700. So even before the governor ever would have been appointed, so he wouldn't have had any former allegiance. 49 years later, that's a long time. Everybody who would have been alive in that era when the Habsburgs were on the throne in Spain would have been dead. Why 49 years after they left would a Habsburg eagle? So that's the kind of thing I stumble across. And right there on the National Park Service site, in the official U.S. National Park Service history, they identify it as the Habsburg eagle, and it clearly isn't. So that would be an example of, as a historian and a journalist and a writer, the kind of things I stumble across that can be baffling and certainly prevent me from going down a certain path in my research until I've unlocked them.
And we've got a question that actually came in during the show from Lee Hambley, who wants to know, how can a GM incorporate puzzles and riddles smoothly into the game? And I said the way I tend to do that when I'm planning out a scenario is that I look for those places where they can be inserted, particularly for puzzles. If I've got certain challenges planned out, I will say, okay, I have these 7 challenge encounters. Do any of them work having a puzzle included? And there's actually a scenario I'm working on right now. It's a dungeon crawl scenario where they're raiding the temple of an old cult, and I found a place to put one because I wanted to have a nice big pit trap encounter, and I thought, well, that's kind of bland. How do I make this pit trap encounter more exciting? I'll make it a puzzle. And from that point, you just have to think of a puzzle. And in this case, the puzzle I came up with, there's an idol to a Cyclops god on one side of the room, and all these random pit traps. There's a good chance if you cross this room, you're just going to fall into a pit trap. But there's an inscription on the wall that says any who the god sees will be cast into hell. So the way you actually cross it, you take a spear that's been left lying in the corner of the room. You have to hit the eye of the idol. And if you blind the god, it can't see you, and all the pit traps deactivate. So that's one way you can smoothly incorporate a puzzle encounter. How about you, Clint?
Well, I think related to that, I think it makes sense for wizards to have puzzle traps, for example, as opposed to locks and traditional locks and stuff like that. Because wizards value intellect, and they can solve those puzzles, whereas they're trying to foil thieves and other light-fingered people who may not necessarily be all that bright, but might have plus 25 to their open lock and disable device checks. So if you have a puzzle trap or a puzzle that has to be solved, and you throw that into the defenses of your magical treasure trove, then it makes sense in game, and it will cause it's a separate kind of foil for that thieves and other people like that are going to have more trouble with. So that's one way.
Good point.
Richard, Mike, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah. I would say that all of us like games. We love games. We devote a lot of our lives to developing games and making them available to people. Certainly, in the context of a fantasy milieu, you could have somebody who loved games. And if somebody has the power to create their own little microcosms, their own dungeons, their own little worlds, whatever, they might very well want to incorporate games as a device for challenging their opponents or the people who they're coming into contact with, or amusing themselves or whatever. So to me, that's compelling and realistic enough. That's a good enough reason to have a game within a game. People enjoy games in our world. Why wouldn't they enjoy games in other worlds?
And Richard, how about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's several different scenarios where I've used puzzles in games because, of course, they're not necessarily something you're going to encounter on a day-to-day basis. Like, I mean, I do make fun of the DMV because it is one of those things. And one of the things that I did in terms of puzzles for an adventure that I wrote that's going to be coming out soon for the Swords Coast setting is an entire puzzle. The entire thing is. And in fact, combat, while it's possible, is highly, let's just say, bad.
Discouraged.
Yes, highly discouraged because very bad things happen if you choose to go the route of combat. And so, and the reason why I did that is because if you look at most novels, in fact, actually most stories, my favorite examples of these would be the Indiana Jones movies. Not the fourth one, but the actual original trilogy of films. There's nothing but puzzles in those movies. Everything that he has to overcome is a puzzle of some sort. He has to figure out the exact height of the staff that the ruby has to go on. He has to, and in order to do that, he has to find where the medallion is, right? Because he had to find, track his old girlfriend, and in order to, and then he had to, figure out what the inscription said, and then he had to find the location for the room. So all of those are examples of puzzles. I mean, there are fights that take place in the film, but they're not what drive the story. What drives that story is, in fact, the puzzles. I mean, even when he's trying to take the idol off the pedestal in the very beginning of the movie and avoid all the traps, he's trying to figure out the puzzle that to avoid all that stuff. And he fails, which is, so it shows how human he really is, because he triggers the damn thing, and he has to run away from the boulder. And then another movie that does a good example of that is The Goonies, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's all puzzles. I mean, it's a giant underground dungeon, but the entire thing is figuring out puzzles, right? They got to figure out the right notes to play on the piano. They got to figure out how to unlock the door with the right combination of key slots for the skull key. And then in the last Indiana Jones movie, the Holy Grail, right? They have to figure out how to spell the name of Jesus in Latin in order to get across. So I mean, all those films that are in that genre, they're all puzzles, and there's action that keeps the characters moving forward, so that way, like, there's tension. But other than that tension, it's nothing but puzzles. So it depends on everything that goes on, and I think it's wholly appropriate. And so that's what I did with my adventure, is while there is this presence of menace, the entire thing rests upon solving the puzzle.
This is actually we're talking about, right?
Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, cat calls. Yeah.
Cat calls. Okay, yeah, we're in production with that. Cat calls will hopefully be out within the next week or so. We're overdue on the darn thing. So yeah, people can look for that. Hopefully, we'll be talking about that on a very upcoming show.
And one last thing in that vein is the book Ready Player One, and friend of the show Diana Lopez. She actually wanted me to read this. She kept bugging me because it's something that she read at the library she works at, and it's really interesting because it goes into gaming history and history of the internet, and it talks about Easter eggs. And the whole premise of the book is around solving puzzles.
Very cool. I found another way you can smoothly insert a puzzle into the game is if you have a puzzle that can stand in for some sort of technical action. I did a sci-fi game ages ago where I had a little circuit board with screws and wires, and their ship's hyperdrive had been sabotaged. So in order to leave the planet they were on and track down the bad guys, they would have to repair it. So I gave them this circuit board with this tangle of wires and a screwdriver. I then gave them the manual for their hyperdrive, and all the manual said was, the power node must be connected to the drive core. However, blue wires can connect to any primary colored wires, but green wires can never connect to yellow wires, and so on and so forth. And with this information, they had to figure out the only possible configuration of wires to link all the key parts of the hyperdrive together. And it was a lot more fun, a lot more challenging, and they got a lot more emotionally invested in it than if they just had to make a technical repair roll.
Sure.
Yeah.
And actually, that also ties in nicely with using games within your game. There's lots of games you can use as a stand-in for technical action. What I've actually got here is the electronic Rubik's Cube. And it's just a little box. You turn it on, and it comes preloaded with, I believe, 6 or 7 game programs you can run on it. One's a lot like Simon, one's kind of a logic puzzle game. But when I'm doing a cyberpunk game, both tabletop or LARP, if someone wants to hack, I will actually hand them this cube, set up one of the games, and how well they hack a system is based on how well they play this game. And it's just like any cheesy cyberpunk movie where, like, your avatar grabs some holographic cube and is twisting it around in their hand, trying to, to get the code out of the corporate data core.
An old Operation game would work well for that too if somebody had one stuffed in the closet somewhere.
Oh yes, and actually, whenever I want someone to defuse a bomb in a LARP, I actually bring out a set of Concentration, that game where you have to put the pieces into the specially shaped holes before the timer runs out. That is an awesome way to simulate, like, defusing a bomb and having that time limit and being under pressure. How about you guys? How do you incorporate games into your games? Clint?
Well, I think that it's important to remember that a lot of games, especially the ones from the Middle Ages and the ancient world, were essentially what we would think of today as war games or war simulations, chess and other games like that. And it began as a way of extrapolating from real-life battle situations into a tabletop experience, essentially. So the idea of a game within a game is exactly that. If you're playing in, especially a game like the Coast setting, for example, which is a fantasized version of the ancient world, then having those kinds of things adds a lot of verisimilitude to the setting. Because they're already they were there in our ancient world, so why shouldn't they be there in a fantasy version of one? So whether you have rules to play them out or not is another thing. Whether you actually want to have a session or part of a session in which your players actually play the fantasy version of chess, or the three-dragon ante, say, for D&D, that kind of thing. That's up to you. Three-dragon ante, I think, is a fine game, and I think it could be fun to play as your characters. I know I did that once as a player, and it was kind of fun. But it seemed to me that a lot of the times there was sort of a been there, done that kind of vibe to that. Once you've done it once, you've experienced that, and just like you won't often go back and redo the same dungeon over again, you won't go back and do the same game over again. So I think a lot of these really live more as background for characters to hang on to sink to sink their teeth into, rather than necessarily occupying the foreground of play. So.
And apropos of being part of the background, I like to incorporate games, whether they're played or not, is a device for saying something about the people that are playing them. So in the Coast setting, we've got a couple of in Swords of Coast Necropolis, the novel, and then the characters that exist in the world. Parthenia, who's an elven barbarian, and Selene, who's a Titanic priestess. They love playing dice games. They love knucklebones. And whenever they're bored, they get them out. But this says something about their personality, that they're very drawn to randomness. They play with all sorts of arbitrary rules. There's no particular balance to their games because this is their worldview. That things are arbitrary and things happen for no reason. So the game that they play is an expression of their worldview. On the other hand, Pumeo, who is a very rigid sort of wizard, and he enjoys playing this chess-like game that's been discovered because it's very regimented and it's very predictable in the way that it's played. Paros just loves games. He likes developing the rules for games. He doesn't really care whether he wins or loses them half so much as he enjoys developing them, which is pretty much like me in a lot of ways. So yeah, I like incorporating the games as a device for telling something, revealing something about the people who are playing them, or how they respond to them. Tell something about themselves through that.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because that Mike brought that up, and going off of what Clint said as well. Keeping things in the background is all well and good, but say you have a character who has a skill in gaming, you're probably going to want to have the games come up more often. But this host is something that I actually taught a class on, is how to read games as cultural, narrative, and performative media. And like Mike's talking about, it tells you something about the people. The games that they enjoy tells you something about what they value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what kind of skills they really truly value, the things that matter to them the most, right? And so I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the games, especially in the old first edition DMG, there's a bunch of dice games and stuff that are in the back, in one of the appendices. There's a bunch of games that you can incorporate into the world for use in like a casino kind of setting, or just people in taverns would be playing these games in the game world wherever you happen to go, right? So you could give them different types of games. So they could be playing cards, or they could be playing dice, something like a backgammon, like a slot machine kind of thing. So depending on what kind of randomness you wanted or how much skill was involved, you could say something about that culture. And so I think that's something that's really important as a background element, in addition to something that you can bring into the foreground every so often, especially, like I said, if the characters have are good at particular types of games, because like some games have skills for gambling, or for different types of backgrounds that it shows that they're specialized in that. So you can use that as a conflict resolution system. I mean, you see this in movies all the time too. It's like, okay, well, best 2 out of 3. If you win, I'll give you the information you want. Fine. Sure. Right? Then you get to have the character, pull out that random skill that looked like a bad choice way back when, right? But it says something about the world, that this random thing is important at some point.
Right. Yep. Good point.
Yeah, and actually, another good way to incorporate games into your games is to have something at stake. Maybe the players are gambling with a land baron who's going to foreclose on a mortgage to get a deed back or something. But something I've often done is I'll often award players bonus experience points for gaming within a game which is actually one of the reasons I do a lot of sci-fi games, and so I've got a few sets of these. These are the Ice House gaming pyramids, which are great if you want to create a sci-fi game really, really quick and on the fly. I was doing a space opera game ages ago where, I always ask in any space opera game when you have a long space voyage, like, okay, what are you doing on this voyage? And one of the players just arbitrarily said, I think my character would like to play chess. And, really? So we got a few of these pieces out, came up with an in-game version of chess, and everybody who played chess got 15 extra experience points. But if you won, you got 50 extra experience points. And this was actually kind of
good way to handle it.
Yeah, and it was cool because I hate saying, okay, you get from point A to point B, so it actually gave us a really interesting downtime. It gave me as the GM time to refine the next encounter once they got to their destination, and the players really got into it, and it became a real role-playing thing. They actually played the game, as their characters. The quiet, contemplative one would just stroke their chin and look at the pieces and make very precise moves. The brash character was trash talking the other two players and trying to psych them out. The character that wasn't that bright and was used to getting their way by physically dominating people kept threatening, if you try to take my queen, I swear I'm going to flip this table over. And it was great. It really brought a lot of life to the game.
Good point.
Cool.
I do have to ask, are you guys fans of role-playing games that use other games as like a substitute for other mechanics, such as like Deadlands, where you actually have to play a poker hand to use magic?
I thought that was cool, specifically for that setting, because of the way that they incorporated it. So
I'm more a fan of pretty much like what we've been talking about, where it's more done as something to just sort of as the exception to the rule. So 9 times out of 10, you should just be making opposed dice rolls to see what happens. If you want to be playing chess, then you should be playing chess instead of a role-playing game. But then every once in a while, throw something in where the players really play the game within a game. But I think for it to stay fun, it needs to be the exception rather than a mechanic. Clint's right. That works well for Deadlands, but just using it routinely as a mechanic, I think would get a little tiresome.
I actually think it can be quite useful, but it has to be fitting for the setting. Because like a good example, because a good example other than the Deadlands would be the Mage Tarot cards, because depending on your character, if they're a cartomancer, that's a perfect prop for that character to use.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, very, very true. All right, and before we wrap up, I did have a question. Does anybody have any other suggestions of movies with good puzzles or riddles in them?
Yeah, good overlooked one is Quintet from 1979, which Richard and I actually found the rules for. It was a movie it's a post-apocalyptic movie set in this city that's icebound, and it's about these people who are playing out the last days of their lives by playing this game called Quintet and then murdering off the people who lose the game. So that's worth taking a look at. I wouldn't say it's a great movie. It's very, very, very low-key. But if anyone wants to see the rules for Quintet, go to D-Infinity Online, d-infinity.net. Richard and I tracked them down and actually analyzed them and posted the rules to the website, I think it was a couple of years ago. So Quintet is up at D-Infinity Online for anyone who's interested. So that's an overlooked movie, so I would suggest it is one people should take a look at.
You could go with Cube.
Oh, the movie Cube?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know it's kind of cheesy, but it's the same thing. It's a giant puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, it's this movie. These people wake up essentially in a giant Rubik's Cube dungeon made of like hundreds of chambers that have different serial numbers, and there's this whole complex mathematical thing to figure out what rooms are safe, which ones are booby-trapped, which rooms will reposition, which ones won't, and it's just this whole human drama of people trying to navigate this massive building-sized puzzle to hopefully find a way out. Yeah, and I guess I was going to say I don't know whether this counts as a puzzle or a riddle or what. But, I love old-fashioned movies. There's an old Danny Kaye movie, The Court Jester, and there's a pivotal moment in the movie where he's looking for he needs there's a potion he has to drink.
Yep.
And he's given this complicated mnemonic device to remember what drink is safe and what drink has the poison in it. And on the one hand, it's a really great tongue twister. The pellet with the poisons and the vessel with the pestle, and so on and so forth. And if you're into wordplay, you can construct these awesome mnemonic device tongue twister type things that your players will have to remember to get through different parts of the game. So I would look to The Court Jester if you're into more wordplay related things.
And it's just a great movie anyway.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, Danny Kaye, fantastic song and dance man. Definitely, I will endorse Danny Kaye's movies. Check them out. The Inspector General is also fantastic.
Yes. Yep.
Has a great bit of leadership advice. Give the people the fist, the wrist, and the finger, which is a great number with that. All right, well, gentlemen, we are about ready to wrap up for the night, but I did want to go around and just everybody give your final thoughts for the show. And I guess my final thought is, if you want to use puzzles, riddles, or games, look for opportunities to organically insert them. I'm actually happy to say we're doing a really cool game within a game at Gen Con this year. Kettlefish Productions, we're running a Star Wars LARP called Luck of the Draw that all takes place in a Sabak tournament. And if you know Sabak from the Star Wars Expanded Universe, it's supposed to be this ridiculously complicated version of space poker where the cards and their values constantly change throughout the game. And we kind of hemmed and hawed about how we were going to do this, and we finally found a solution. We're going to go online and order a bunch of blank Flux cards from the Looney Labs game Flux, which is a card game where the rules constantly change, and we're building our own Star Wars themed Flux deck, and that's how we're going to incorporate Sabak as our game within a game. And it's going to be a lot of work, but it's going to be tremendously fun, so I relish that challenge. How about you, Richard? Your final thoughts?
Well, if you're looking for something for puzzles that can be used organically, one of the products that we put out is my hedge mazes. There's two parts. Set one, which is the core set of the maze. It's just the heart, which can be used to create an infinite loop. And then the second set allows you to actually order that off so that way you can end the whole thing. And it's a good way to give your adventure something that's a puzzle without it having to be like randomly inserted, because you can have it as like part of an estate and like, oh look, there's the hedge maze.
And I don't know if you were aware, we ended up printing out full sets of both Hedge Mazes 1 and Hedge Mazes 2 and using them in the Skirmisher Game Pavilion at Comic Palooza. So we actually had an ongoing game with several sets of our paper miniatures battling each other in your Hedge Mazes.
Cool.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was our Nilfs miniatures battling our Reptile Man miniatures. Nilfs versus Reptile Man in your Hedge Mazes.
That's awesome.
There's a pulp adventure in there somewhere.
Yeah,
Mike, what are your... Knowing, Mike, that you always reserve a second final thought, what is your first final thought?
No. All I would say is, just apropos of everything we've talked about tonight, check out Richard's Hedge Mazes. Check out his cat calls when we bring it out within the next week or so, because they are good examples of things that we've developed that support the theme of what we're talking about tonight. I'm behind the scenes working on those, even as we speak, working on cat calls right now. So be sure to check those out. And the other thing we're working on right now, of course, that all four of us are working on is our Lives of Coast, which is going to be 115 to 120 bios of characters from the Coast setting. They can be incorporated into other settings as well. and we're down to, I think, 15 bios right now. So as soon as we can get those done ASAMFP, we're going to move that book into production and come out with it as well. So a lot going on behind the scenes that people are going to start to be able to see.
Excellent. And Clint, as our guest, you have the final word.
I would say, as is the case for a lot of things in gaming, less is more when it comes to puzzles and riddles and stuff like that. So if you're going to incorporate them, make it something that adds flavor. Don't make it something that is the only flavor. The puzzles and riddles can convey a lot of fun to a game that without actually being the dominant thing in a game.
Very sage advice, Clint. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been D-Infinity Live, Puzzles, Riddles, and Games. For myself, William T. Thrasher, for returning co-host Richard T. Balsley, for the always jolly Mike Jolly Varhola, who found his jolly back in the middle of this episode.
I've always got my jolly.
Yeah. And for our special guest, Clint Staples, this has been D-Infinity Live, and we will see you all next week.